Hey everybody, ASMRFTB here with my first non-ASMR Magic the Gathering video. But I was just deck building and playing a bit of Dominaria United Standard. And I was thinking to myself, if mono black is so prevalent, a control deck would be a fun thing to play. And I was thinking of good blue cards that control can use, and I thought of Hullbreaker Horror and a bunch of other stuff, and I decided that I ended up not really making a control deck at all. But I was just thinking that there were a lot of blue cards that were really good in Standard right now. Delver of Secrets, Fading Hope, Ledger Shredder, which in the deck you can see in front of you I have replaced with a Fairy Vandal, but it's imminently going to be replaced with a Ledger Shredder once I get enough wild cards. And then you have, some powerful counter spells and things of that nature. So what I ended up was building a tempo deck. And when I was thinking to myself about tempo and about Magic the Gathering, it not necessarily dawned on me, but it's just fascinating what the word tempo means to everybody who plays Magic the Gathering, because I think that everybody has their own understanding of what tempo is, their own understanding, their own definition of really what tempo is and what it means to the game, or in the context of the game. And I don't think necessarily anybody's wrong. I think everybody's right in their own way. I think everybody in their own definitions has fragments of the truth, fragments of accuracy in them. Even my understanding of what tempo is, I think it isn't completely right, but isn't also completely wrong. But it's elusive. Finding the actual definition, what is tempo, and I think a lot of people think that they're right, and I think that I'm right, but I don't think everybody's completely right. But again, I don't think everybody's completely wrong. So the idea of what it is it's fascinating. It really is. Just a lot of the minutia of the game I could talk about for hours, and tempo is one of those things. I remember probably a couple months ago, Paulo Vitor Damarosa actually put out a tweet that just said, "What is tempo?" And when you looked at the replies, it was just fascinating to see how many people answered and how different some of the answers could be. And every time I read an answer, I was like, yeah, that's what tempo is. Yeah, that's what tempo is. Yeah, that's what tempo is. But, there are parts that I agreed with and parts that I didn't agree with, but I thought every answer was reasonable. So I just wanted to make this video to tell you what I think my definition of tempo is, to kind of give you my understanding or my interpretation of what tempo is, and see if maybe it makes more sense to you than that way after explaining it, or maybe you disagree vehemently with what I'm about to say. And I'd love to hear your opinions either way. Also, notably, this is my first non-ASMR video, which I kind of wanted to make one to see if people care, to see if people would still watch if I'm not whispering and going for the ultimate goal of helping people just kind of wind down after a long day or something like that. So if people would want to see more of this type of content, I'd be more than happy to make it. And also, I don't know, just this subject specifically isn't something I wanted to sit behind a microphone and try to make people relax about, because it's something I'm passionate about, something I really have an interest in, and would like to hear what other people think and what have you. But anyway, so, and I hate to do this, but Webster's Dictionary defines, now, if you do a cursory Google search of tempo, and what is tempo, what is the definition of tempo? So Google, or the Oxford Languages Dictionary, defines tempo as the speed at which a passage of music is or should be played. Which obviously, tempo in music is important, but in the context of Magic the Gathering, obviously that is irrelevant. The second definition that Google provides us with is the rate or speed of motion or activity, in other words, pace. And I think that is the applicable definition that you could use, at least in the way that it's described here. Do I think that maybe this specific definition, do I think the definition of the word tempo itself defines what it is within the context of Magic the Gathering? No. But I think it is a good starting point. I think that tempo in a game of Magic could describe the pace of a game. It's my understanding that the pace of a game could be defined as a player's attempt to use their mana efficiently to win the game. Now, that is obviously kind of a very bare bones. I mean, everybody's obviously trying to use their mana efficiently to win a game. That's the point of playing Magic the Gathering, is to win the game. But what I think the definition of tempo really means is using your mana. I think it's like a hyper focus in mana efficiency, using your mana so efficiently that you force your opponent to use theirs inefficiently to the point where they fall so far behind that they lose the game. So what does this mean? Tempo of a game. I haven't even defined it yet. So I would say that tempo in the context of Magic the Gathering is, I think, the pace of the game. What then is the pace of the game? I think the pace of the game is the player's attempts. Oh no, I did already do this. Whatever, I'm talking in circles. But yes, I think the pace of the game is the definition of tempo within the context of a Magic the Gathering game. And I think what the pace of the game is, because I think that you can't just say tempo is the pace of the game and then not explain what you think the pace of the game is players' attempts to use their mana efficiently to win the game. So what is a tempo? In the context of tempo, a lot of decks are described as tempo decks. So what makes a tempo deck? And I think what tempo decks attempt to do is control the pace of the game, but maybe not necessarily control, because that a control deck tries to control the pace of the game. And this kind of gets into another kind of idea is I think every kind of deck tries to utilize tempo in some way. So is every deck a tempo deck? Or what defines a tempo deck? So control decks try to control the pace of the game. They try to use permission and denial to prevent their opponent from playing big threats, and everybody knows what a control deck does. It's frustrating and horrible to play against, but so is a control deck a tempo deck? Is a mid-range deck that just tries to use its mana efficiently every single turn and quote-unquote curve out, play a big threat on turn 1, big threat turn 2, big threat turn 3, so on and so forth, and until you've played such a big threat and your opponent runs out of answers, and then you win the game. Is that a tempo deck because it's trying to use its mana efficiently in that way? And I think in a lot of cases when people define a tempo deck, when people say they're playing a tempo deck, or when people refer to a deck as a tempo deck, it's not a control deck. It's not a mid-range deck. A lot of the times what we see is, and I would say that probably a great deck right now would be Izzet Murktide in Modern, would be a fantastic example of a tempo deck. But what about Murktide Regent, or Izzet Murktide in Modern? What about it makes it a tempo deck? How is it trying to use its mana efficiently? How is it trying to control the pace of the game? So in my definition of a tempo deck, I think what a tempo deck does is it tries to enact an extremely, as I mentioned before, it has a hyper focus on mana efficiency. So it tries to enact an extremely efficient game plan. And then through use of permission spells and spells that deny your opponent's ability to remove threats or answer your threats in an efficient manner, in such a way that they become less mana efficient, you essentially put them behind, and then eventually they fall so far behind that they lose the game. So how I'm going to explain this is I'm going to use Izzet Murktide as an example. So Izzet Murktide is a blue-red deck that is probably considered tier 1, one of the best 2 or 3 decks in Modern right now. And what it tries to do is land early and efficient, valuable threats, things like Ragavan, things like Dragon Rage Channeler, Ledger Shredder, Brazen Borrower. I haven't seen Brazen Borrower in a lot of lists, so this list is just something I pulled up on Google, so don't take this as the end-all be-all list for Is it Murktide? This is just an example, and a lot of the staples are in this deck. So it lands early into efficient threats like Dragon Rage Channeler, which, as everybody who's played against a Dragon Rage Channeler knows, it can take over an entire game with its, it's a 1 mana 1/1 creature that can become a 3/3 flyer that attacks every turn. So it can be a very, efficient threat, a 1 mana 3/3 flyer. And it also has the ability to surveil. So anytime you play an instant or sorcery, you can look at the top card of your library and you can put it into your graveyard. So you get a bit of card selection out of it. So it's a 1 mana spell that has literally so much value attached to it. So it's a very efficient spell. You pay 1 mana and you get all of this out of a card. It's incredible. Ragavan, 1 mana, 1 red mana, legendary creature. When it attacks or when it deals combat damage to a player, create a treasure token. So it makes mana, and then also you get to look at the top. You exile the top card of your opponent's library, and you can cast that card this turn, I believe. Until end of turn, you may cast that card, yes. It also has a dash ability where you just pay 2 mana, so, 1 mana over its normal casting cost. You can play it. It has haste. You can attack with it, and then after it deals the combat damage and, you play the spell if you want to, it returns to your hand. Obviously, you're generating mana. You're exiling the top card of a library, possibly playing your opponent's spells. Anybody who plays against a Ragavan knows that this card is incredibly good. So you're playing very efficient. 2 1-mana spells that if unanswered, obviously any unanswered threat in Magic the Gathering takes over the game, but you get my point. These are very efficient ways to take over a game, possibly. And at the very least, these are threats that have to be answered very quickly. I guess that's the point. These are threats that have to be answered almost immediately, or your opponent will eventually lose tempo, lose pace. They will fall behind. And then obviously your top end, you have Ledger Shredder, which I think is also a very good, maybe less of a very immediate threat. I think a Ledger Shredder can stick around. It does provide card selection. It is a flying threat, but it takes a little while to build up, and it only becomes a bigger threat. Unlike Ragavan, which, at any time could be a threat if it hits the right card off the top of your library. And also generates mana immediately, and Dragon Rage Channeler, which after Delirium becomes a huge threat, things like that. I think Ledger Shredder is a little bit slower of a threat, but it's still very good, and does provide card advantage. But, I don't think that this is something that is as immediate. If a Ledger Shredder hits the battlefield, I'm not worried about it immediately. Dragon Rage Channeler and a Ragavan, I'm very concerned about and want to answer pretty quickly. And then your top end is your top end is Murktide Regent, which is a spell that you can use Delve, so you get rid of all of these spells that you're casting to. I don't need to explain. Is it Murktide to you? If you're watching this and you play Modern, you know what it is. For those of you who don't, it's a threat that can be used to interact with your graveyard to make it cheaper to cast, and then it's a flying threat with +1/+1 counters on it to help you win the game. Again, it's just a cheap threat. It's an efficient threat that is easier to cast because you can discount its casting cost using exiling cards from your graveyard. So it's an efficient threat that can be, it's flying, so it's evasive and it's efficient. So after you've landed some early threats and you've denied your opponent their ability to remove those threats, you put this guy down, and then the game is probably over. If they can't answer the earlier threats, and then they can't answer this guy, if they don't have enough answers in their hand, you've controlled their ability to interact with the game in such a way that they have fallen behind. You have put them behind pace, or put them behind in the pace of the game. And I think that is my definition of what a tempo deck is. It doesn't necessarily try to control your opponent. And that's the thing, is what I'm getting stuck with here is it's controlling in the way that it uses permission spells like a control deck. And I guess, in all of the archetypes of Magic the Gathering, you could define it as aggro control. Is that what tempo is? Where you have aggressive early threats, and then you protect them with permission spells, and just deny your opponent the ability to interact with your board or with you in a meaningful way by using permission spells. Is that what a tempo deck is? Is it an aggro control deck? Things like remember Dimir Rogues in Standard a little while ago, and Lurrus Rogues in Standard a little while ago. God, remember when Omnath and Dimir Rogues were like the two best decks? And then Omnath got banned, and then Dimir Rogues was really good. What a time. But yeah, so is aggro control the definition of tempo? Is that what you would say? And in a way, I think that that's true. I think that I think that like a deck that could be defined as aggro control, like Dimir Rogues back in that previous standard. I think that, what was it, the rotation before or the rotation even before that? I can't remember, but or aggro control decks like Dimir Rogues and Is It Murktide. Would you define Is It Murktide as an aggro control, some sort of mixture of aggro and control? And is that what you would define as tempo? And aggro control decks tempo decks? I'd say that, I mean, not in all cases. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of decks out there, and I think they can be defined in a lot of different ways. But overall, would I say that like this and something like Dimir Rogues could be that, which I would say undoubtedly are a version of aggro control? Is that what tempo is? And I think it kind of is, but kind of not. Not in every case, maybe. I don't know of an aggro controlled deck necessarily that I would say isn't, off the top of my head, as I only really know of those two right now. But yeah, is aggro control the definition of tempo? Is it using your early and efficient threats? Is that what a tempo deck is? Does a tempo deck always use early and efficient threats? Maybe not. But at that point, what are you just talking about a control deck where it just tries to control the game until your opponent runs out of threats and valuable, valuable cards, and then you eventually win the game by dropping a very powerful threat that you can either protect or just your opponents run out of gas? Is that the usage of tempo in such a way that you can define a control deck as a tempo deck? I don't know. Maybe the term tempo deck is just erroneous. Maybe because every deck utilizes tempo in some way, they're all tempo decks. Or maybe we've just applied the term tempo deck to these decks that have a hyper focus on it. Maybe we should just, but then again, maybe tempo deck is just an easier word to say than aggro control. Yeah, I don't know. Again, I have 1 page of notes here, and I've already gone through all of them, and the rest I've just been talking for, and it's been almost 20 minutes. So yeah, but I think I've gotten to the point where I've expressed what I think tempo is to you, and I really would like to hear what everybody else has to say. So to reiterate, I think that my definition of tempo is a player, or my definition of tempo would be, in the context of Magic the Gathering, would be the pace of the game. And that is players trying to utilize their mana efficiently, or utilize their mana in such a way that they win the game. And I mean, I guess like you could go into a little bit more detail on that, because obviously I think time, rather than just using mana to win the game, there's also a factor of tempo has time associated with it. Each turn, using your mana efficiently each turn to win the game, I guess would be a better way to kind of get that, the important factor of time in there. But more importantly, I think what my definition of a tempo game is enacting an extremely and hyper efficient game plan, and using permission spells in such a way that your opponent falls behind and cannot keep up with the pace of the game that you have set. You set the pace of the game with these early threats. You use permission spells to protect them, and powerful, cheap threats later in the game to close a game. But essentially, setting the pace of the game and controlling the pace of the game in such a way that your opponent falls behind, and to the point where they eventually lose. Yeah, so I would say that is my definition of tempo. And I'd love to hear what everybody else defines as tempo, what they think tempo is. I guess to wrap up the video, I can show you the deck that I built. Of course, yeah, an early version of the deck had Hullbreaker Horror in it. I think we're going to give a different crab the deck box here. But in Arena, I built a deck that I think could be defined as a tempo deck. So you utilize early threats like Delver of Secrets and Fairy Vandal and Storm Chaser Drake to establish an advantage. These are cheap early threats. Delver of Secrets is a 1-mana 1/1 that you reveal the top card of your library. If it's an instant or sorcery, it becomes a 3/2 flying. Again, not as, I mean, these are not nowhere new. I mean, these are standard cards, so they're not going to be anywhere near as good as cards that were printed specifically for Modern. But regardless, a 1-mana 3/2 flyer is good. It doesn't really have much other upside aside from that, but it's good. Fairy Vandal. Again, this is going to become a Ledger Shredder when I have enough wild cards, because I don't want to focus so much on drawing, but it's a flash flying 1/2 Fairy Rogue. Whenever you draw your second card, put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it's a threat that can grow over time. Ledger Shredder will be better because it gives us card selection, and you don't need to draw cards. You just need to cast a second spell. This deck has a lot of spells that are very cheap, so you're going to hopefully be casting a lot. And so you establish early threats, and Storm Chaser Drake, when it becomes the target of a spell target of a spell you control, draw a card. We have spells like Shore Up and Combat Research, which can target, and potentially Fading Hope, that we target our Storm Chaser Drake with, and then we draw cards, and it's a 2/1 flyer. So establish some early threats. These threats have some efficiency to them. They have some abilities that are advantageous. And then hopefully through protecting them and denying your opponents the ability to cast their own threats or answer your threats in an efficient manner, we win the game. So you put down a Delver of Secrets, it becomes, or 2 Delver of Secrets, they become 2 3/2 flyers. You protect them. You deny your opponents the ability to put down bigger threats or threats that could outpace you, and then hopefully win the game. So, our permission spells are obviously going to be counter spells, especially in mono blue. So we have Make Disappear, we have Fading Hope to bounce your opponent's threat. So, they pay mana to put something down. If they have to pay that mana to put it down again, assuming it's not a haste threat, you could outpace them with Delver of Secrets. So if they put down a 6/6 and you have 2 Delver of Secrets down and they have to replay that 6/6 over multiple turns after you Fading Hope it or something like that, you understand. Negate, so we have permission spells to protect our board and ensure that we remain ahead of our opponent in some manner, typically by just beating them down with flying threats like Delver of Secrets and maybe a Fairy Vandal or a Storm Chaser Drake. So I would say I built a tempo deck, and then I started thinking about tempo, and I just kind of wanted to make a video. So that's what this video was. So I'll probably make an ASMR video with this deck just to see. I mean, I just built it, and I want to see if it's any good. I think so. I put in 4 Impulse. Maybe I should save this for the video so I don't talk too much about it. But I built a tempo deck in Dominarius. It's a standard deck, so it's nothing to write home about. But it's fun to play regardless. But well, I haven't played it much yet. But anyway. Built a tempo deck. I started thinking about tempo. I started trying to define what I think tempo is. I remembered that tweet that PVDDR put out there a long time ago, and I started thinking about, like, every time I go to my local game store, people, sometimes people mention tempo or tempo decks, and it just got me thinking about what I would define it as, and trying to understand other people's interpretations. So I decided I would make a video about it. So. I did. So hopefully you have enjoyed this. Hopefully you've enjoyed non-ASMR content, as I would love to make more of it if people are interested. And I do like essay style videos where you kind of, not necessarily do research. All I did is Google search what the word tempo is in Google, but I did have to think a lot and write my thoughts down on a page, and what other people at the local game store said tempo was, and taking that into consideration when I tried to define it myself. So things that take more thought than just I built a deck, I'm whispering about it to help you relax, and then I'm going to play a couple games with it. So if people have interest in this type of or style of video and would like more in-depth stuff like this, there's a million things that I could make videos on and would love to. Obviously, if you are still interested in the ASMR content, I will absolutely be making more of that in the near future. I think probably right after this, I'll hopefully be recording a Blue Tempo ASMR video for anybody who wants to watch that. And then, So, thanks everybody so much for watching. We are up to like 200 and something subscribers, which is fucking insane. I never thought anybody would watch this. I thought this was just going to be a hobby that no one would watch, and I would just make videos for nobody. So, really, really happy that anybody took an interest in watching at all. Hopefully the ASMR stuff has helped people, get some sleep, relax after a long day, just watch some content, pass some time. And then hopefully if you guys take to this type of content too, I can make more stuff and have more in-depth conversations about abstract concepts within the game that we all love to play, Magic the Gathering, and maybe even other games, video games, mechanics in video games and things like that. So after all, this is a gaming channel, not a specifically Magic the Gathering channel. So yeah, thanks everybody for watching. I really, really appreciate all of you who take the time to watch the videos, who comment, and if you would like to subscribe to, watch more and be notified when I upload or whatever, I have no idea what even subscribing does, but the fact that you do it means a lot to me. So thanks so much, everybody. We'll catch you later.